Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for checking out my show, Coin Stories, where I get to hear from the leading voices in Bitcoin, financial markets and investing, political structures, philosophy, and more. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like the video so more people see it, and hit that notifications button so you don't miss out on any new content. This podcast does not provide financial advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So make sure to do your own research before making any investment decision and be aware of your risk tolerance. I'm able to produce this show thanks to my sponsors, and I'm very picky about who I choose to partner with. So I hope you take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. All right, now to my first partner, where I buy my Bitcoin, Swan. I partnered with Swan because it is a Bitcoin-only company focused on helping people save for their future and self-custody their Bitcoin, not trade it. You can start a direct deposit to take advantage of Bitcoin as a savings technology and learn how to take it off the exchange. Swan's mission is to educate 10 million future Bitcoiners through free resources and media projects like Hard Money. Swan also offers retirement planning with an IRA, tax loss harvesting, home equity conversion, and a white glove private client service. I use Swan to dollar cost average every day. That's right. I deposit a little bit every day that's equivalent to what I might spend on a meal so that I add to my future nest egg and lower my yearly cost basis. To learn more and get $10 in free Bitcoin when you sign up, head to swanbitcoin.com/Natalie Brunell. Welcome back to the show. I'm really excited to have back with me Pierre Rochard, who I haven't spoken to on the podcast for more than a year, but he was actually one of my very first guests. Pierre, thank you so much. I just listened back to our interview, and fascinating to go back in time and hear your takes on Bitcoin and why people should invest.
Thanks for having me back on, Natalie.
Well, a lot of people very familiar with your response that went viral to the New York Times article. So that's really what I want to focus on, and sort of this energy FUD that's happening. We're seemingly in the then they fight us stage, and there's more, regulatory pressure. But here's the New York Times coming out swinging, saying that there's this huge cost to all these communities because Bitcoin uses so much energy, and it's clear from the article that they really don't understand why Bitcoin uses energy, why that's important. So let me just zoom out and get your reaction. When you first read that article, what were your thoughts?
Well, my first thought was finally, because I knew that they'd been working on this article for a while. They'd been asking Riot and others in the mining industry questions over the past several weeks and months. And so it did not come as a surprise at all. And I actually thought that it was more favorable than I was expecting, in the sense that they do include some good facts in there. And in particular, I thought that they did a good job of explaining the value proposition of Bitcoin, that it's a monetary system that exists outside of governments and banks and corporations. And so it's an open network. I think just that paragraph alone, maybe that's what caused the Bitcoin price to go up after they published.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about what they said about, companies like yours. 'Cause last time we were on the show, you were actually working at Kraken. You weren't at Riot yet. So maybe let people know about your transition. What do you do for Riot? Give us a lay of the landscape. I mean, it's one of the biggest public miners in the world, and the US is really leading in the industry right now. And why does it use energy?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was working at Kraken, we also had a hit piece written on us by New York Times. So maybe they're just following my career around, attacking my employers. Um, I think that, first of all, this article is symptomatic of the tremendous success that Bitcoin mining has had in the United States. That it has grown so much, in particular after China banned Bitcoin mining. We saw a massive outflow of hash rate to the US, to other countries. Now, interestingly, China still has 20 to 25% of the hash rate. So lots of open questions there about what this ban really is about. But in any case, the US is now the number one hash rate Bitcoin mining geography. And in particular, Texas, because Texas has an abundance of energy in different forms. So there's wind, there's solar, and there's natural gas. And so those three factors have made the cost of electricity in Texas particularly competitive. And Texas also benefits from having a very market-based approach to electricity. So ERCOT is what's called a deregulated market, even though it's still very well regulated. That's how I would describe it. It's well regulated because it is about matching up supply and demand in a way that doesn't make value judgments about what people are using electricity for, and that is approaching electricity production from an economic perspective, that even, for example, coal and natural gas, these are facilities that are regulated by the EPA, right? So their emissions are already regulated by environmental regulators here in the United States at the federal level and at the state level as well. And so just, as long as everyone is following the rules, this is a market where you can have tremendous economic growth and opportunity. So Texas also has, you might look at other states and say, oh, this state has very low electricity prices too. But the problem is that they don't have the depth in the market, whereas Texas has dozens of gigawatts of supply and demand. Other states have a fraction of that. So it really speaks to the fact that Texas is the energy capital of the United States, I'd argue of the world, and that makes it the ideal Bitcoin mining capital as well. And that attracted the attention of the New York Times. And it goes back to that first email response to Satoshi of saying, "Hey, this proof of work thing is going to consume a massive amount of electricity." And I think that the reason why the electricity consumption gets attacked so much, aside from, I think that there's the good faith argument of, hey, look, we want to use electricity for saving lives, right? Things that are very tangible to people, for manufacturing goods and services, or that they are legitimately concerned about carbon emissions. But on a fundamental level, the only reason Bitcoin is decentralized is because of the electricity consumption it has. And all of the other systems, like all proof of stake or other consensus mechanisms, they sacrifice decentralization in order to avoid this energy consumption. So I think that in a way, attacking Bitcoin's energy consumption is a way of attacking its decentralization and trying to bring this whole monetary network under the jackboot of folks who want to control other people's lives.
Yeah, you're right. And they actually said that there are other cryptocurrencies that use less energy. They named Ethereum. They said, quote, that's the second most popular cryptocurrency and reduced the electricity needed to power the network by more than 99% by switching its algorithm. It rewards people and trusts them to update the ledger because they're willing to put up their own money as collateral, not because they've spent money to power guessing computers as Bitcoin does. But Bitcoin advocates oppose changing their algorithm, saying it has proved resistant to attacks for longer and at a greater scale than any other approach. So basically, they're saying that the only reason is to make our network secure, which is, it doesn't make sense. If I was new to Bitcoin, I didn't really understand the network, the asset. I wouldn't understand what having a secure network means, and the justification that they essentially made for why Ethereum is so much better because it uses less energy. So can you kind of break that down a little bit more? Because you hit the nail on the head. If you sacrifice the energy component, then you lose that decentralization. You have to introduce potentially governance. In a world of proof of stake, that means someone like Jeff Bezos is going to have way more power because he can stake a lot more coins than the average working mom at home who's just trying to save for her future. So can you break down, for someone who doesn't understand energy, who conflates energy with electricity — most of us are not experts in this field — why is energy so important and critical to Bitcoin?
Yeah, so there's two parts to it. The biggest part currently is about what's called seigniorage. So when we look at the revenue that goes to Bitcoin miners, 98% of that revenue is the new issuance of Bitcoin, adding Bitcoin to the ledger through what's called the subsidy within the mining reward. So the mining reward is the subsidy plus the transaction fees. Currently, the subsidy is about 98% of the mining reward. Um, and that is really what Satoshi was talking about when he analogized to gold mining, which is that by introducing the units onto the ledger in a way that is costly through proof of work, that you remove the possibility of having monopoly profits from the issuance of the currency. And that's called seigniorage, those monopoly profits. So in the traditional fiat system, the seigniorage, the profits go to bankers and politicians. And then they use that money to go buy votes or to buy yachts or whatever they're spending that seigniorage profit on. Um, and they really don't like that Bitcoin doesn't have seigniorage profits. If you look at the Bitcoin mining industry, it's hyper competitive. It's really hard to turn a profit in this industry, and I think the New York Times acknowledged that as well, and stated that companies have gone bankrupt Bitcoin mining, um, and that sometimes the power trading strategies around demand response can earn more in revenue than the Bitcoin mining itself in terms of profitability. So I thought it was interesting that they were mentioning these facts, but not connecting the dots to, hey, this is because this industry is so competitive, and it's not like the fiat system where everyone has a monopoly, a license to print money, and they can keep out competitors using the anti-counterfeiting laws, right? So ultimately, when we talk about the security of Bitcoin versus the security of the dollar, what we're talking about is the issuance, the counterfeiting. And with the dollar, one tragic example is George Floyd. He was murdered by the police as a result of being accused of counterfeiting a $20 bill. And so ultimately, that is the energy consumption of the fiat system in protecting its unit. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's peaceful. It does not rely on violence or threats of violence. And furthermore, it is something that's verifiable. So if you're running a Bitcoin node, you can actually verify that the Bitcoin miners are not creating more Bitcoin than the protocol allows them to. So that's the first piece of the security. The second piece is about the transaction fees. So transaction fees currently, they're about 2% of the revenue for Bitcoin miners. And people who are sending Bitcoin to each other, broadcasting a Bitcoin transaction, they include a fee in their transaction to get their transaction included in a block. And a block is batch of transactions that is being created by a mining pool. And then by being in that block, they have transaction finality. So they know the transaction cannot be reversed or double spent. This is actually I think the central innovation of Bitcoin and what the Satoshi's white paper is about. His white paper tangentially mentions the gold mining metaphor and the absence of seigniorage, but really the focus is on creating a decentralized clock or a time stamping server, as he calls it, that allows for ordering sets of transactions in sequentially, so that you're not spending the same money twice. Traditionally, that's done with a centralized clock. So, for example, at your bank will decide what order your transactions come in on. There was a scandal about this recently, actually, at Wells Fargo, I believe, where apparently all the banking scandals happen, where they were ordering transactions in order to maximize overdraft fees, not based on when did the transaction come in from. So, being able to control the clock on the ledger allows you to manipulate the ledger. And Bitcoin mining is a decentralized clock that cannot be manipulated. And that's really the second part of it. So I'd say it's anti-seigniorage technology and also decentralized timekeeping.
Going back to the New York Times article, it seemed like their two biggest issues with Bitcoin were the rising costs for, say, the average person and their electrical bills, and then emissions. And I think that they, want to paint Bitcoin as this pollutant who's making the environment in Texas and anywhere that they mine dirtier, driving, us toward more and more climate change and an unsustainable future. So let's talk about both. Because first of all, there are talks about whether the photo was doctored, right? They put up a photo of a city. I think they're over. Is that Bitdeer's plant that they were over? And it looks like hazier. What is that debate online right now?
Yeah, so the photo that they took of is a combination of three things. It's a decommissioned coal power plant, Sandow, that was decommissioned decades ago, and so there's no pollution over there. A decommissioned aluminum Alcoa plant that was connected with this coal-fired power plant because aluminum is energy intensive, right? It requires lots of electricity. And now Bitdeer has been putting Bitcoin mining rigs inside of that facility because it has access to a switch, a large electrical switch, because of the existence of that aluminum plant in past years. Now, because there's no pollution in this area, it's beautiful. I mean, it's clear blue skies on, it's Texas, it's hill country. Although it's north of hill country, I don't know if it's more like the plains. But in any case, there's no smog. It's a small town. There's more smog in downtown Austin from cars than there is in this rural town where it's just cows and whatnot. So in order to drive their point home, I think that they wanted to have this decommissioned coal and aluminum plant amped up with some smog and make it look like, oh, Bitcoin miners are doing this, when really Bitcoin miners had nothing to do with the coal plant that was there before, and there's no smog. So I personally, I think that they are really misleading their readers by doing this. It reminds me of all the times that they have actually kind of engaged in this kind of behavior, in particular with the lead up to the Iraq War, where the New York Times reporting was misleading their readership into believing that there were weapons of mass destruction being developed in Iraq. And subsequent to that, subsequent to the invasion, and subsequent to, I think, over 1 million Iraqis dying in this conflict, I don't believe any weapons of mass destruction were ever found. So it's just, New York Times needs to be held accountable for the amount of disinformation they've put out over the years.
All right, it's time for another short break to hear these messages from my sponsors. First up, Bitcoin Conference 2023. The world's largest Bitcoin conference is returning to Miami Beach from May 18th to May 20th. Day one is Industry Day with a focus on business-minded panels and discussions, plus top-tier networking opportunities. General admission days 2 and 3 are open to all pass holders and feature panels, keynotes, and workshops with speakers like Michael Lewis, Michael Saylor, Jack Mallers, Lynn Alden, Arthur Hayes, and more. Plus some exciting new additions like the inaugural Bitcoin Games and the Mining Village, and the return of Pitch Day. I highly recommend this conference. It's what launched my career. And if you want to come, just head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL, HODL, for 10% off. I'll see you in Miami Beach. Next up, Fold. Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase, from Amazon to groceries to sprucing up your wardrobe, with Fold's Bitcoin Cashback debit card. And you can win free Satoshis every day, or even play for the chance to win a whole Bitcoin by spinning the daily wheel and the purchase rewards wheel. And now on Fold, you can buy Bitcoin directly and earn even more incentives and rewards by using the app to stack sats. It's an amazing app to get someone totally new into Bitcoin. So if you want to join the fun, head to foldapp.com/Natalie and get 10,000 in free sats when you sign up.
New York Times needs to be held accountable for the amount of disinformation they've put out over the years.
Well, I even mentioned on Twitter that they have been so wrong about disruptive technologies over many, many decades. I mean, going back to how they covered early airplane technology, they said it would take 1 to 10 million years for man to fly. And then a week later, the Wright brothers took off in their first flight. And they covered the internet. I mean, with Krugman saying that, oh, the internet's impact won't be any bigger than the fax machine was on society. I mean, it's just wild how wrong they have been and continue to be. And, one thing that you and I talked about in our first episode that we did I released it in June 2021. And you talked about how there's just more and more government control, right? You said that it's a form of monetary communism, because if the government is stepping in any way, saying what is good energy use and what's bad, that's communism. And it seems like today, unfortunately, the journalists who are supposed to be the watchdogs and serve as that fourth branch, holding the government accountable, are just regurgitating the government narrative. And I remember you mentioning, there was a reason why you looked at Wikipedia. You were trying to decentralize your information sources because you were living in France, and it seemed like everything was just fed to you as this narrative of France is so great. And here it seems we have that with, the media today, which is frustrating for me coming from a journalism background. I started to get very disillusioned, feeling like the public's not getting the truth. They're getting the truth of what the government believes and says. And so can you talk a little bit about that, because in order to move us in the right direction of education, the mainstream news needs to start really learning about Bitcoin and being more fair and not just showing the negative side effects.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Bitcoin's getting caught up into this debate about carbon emissions that I find surprising, because if we go back to maybe we were in middle school or elementary school when folks were talking about the ozone layer and CFCs and how the ozone layer was being destroyed, and that's bad for the planet. And that was entirely correct. That was purely scientific. And the Montreal Protocol banned ozone depleting chemicals like CFCs, and phased them out. And we were actually, it's a huge success story of science that we reversed this ozone hole, and now the planet is healing. Um, Unfortunately, on the carbon emissions side, the science has been thrown out the window, and it has been completely politicized. It's been taken over by politicians and also by rent-seeking industries that are greenwashing and saying, "Hey, look, we're climate friendly, we're green, we're zero carbon," and it's become like this political marketing tool rather than an actual scientific endeavor of how do we stop carbon emissions. In particular, they've created a bizarre system of carbon accounting, as they call it. Now, I'm an accountant, so I got my bachelor and master in accounting from UT Austin. What they're talking about is not accounting. They should not be allowed to use that word. I mean, it's even fraudulent to bring up the word. But they instead of focusing on actual emissions of CO2 molecules, which they call scope 1 emissions, which are real, and I think that's the area to focus on. They actually, I think they faced a really difficult challenge when it came to focusing on scope 1, because at the end of the day, the only alternative to coal and natural gas that is economical is nuclear. And there's this conflict within the green environmentalist movement between is nuclear good or not because it's zero carbon and it's safe. It's interesting. Nuclear emits less radiation than a coal-fired power plant. And it's just, it's very well contained. And it just got a bad rap because of communists with Chernobyl, essentially causing this meltdown and not having a great response to it. In any case, because they cannot accept that nuclear is the way to replace coal and natural gas, they've decided to create scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And these are basically saying that if you use electricity, you are indirectly emitting CO2 because indirectly you're causing a natural gas or coal power plant to turn on. And their goal here is rather than fixing the production of electricity with nuclear, they're going to try to reduce the consumption of electricity with scope 2 and scope 3. Now, the problem with that is that electricity is critical for human flourishing. We cannot have a modern civilization, and we certainly can't progress technologically without electricity, without increasing levels of consumption of electricity per capita. That's the number one way to improve our standard of living. And we all want to create a world that is better than the world we were raised in for our children. And that requires more electricity consumption, not less. So I think that's the quandary, the paradox that they're in. And they're trying to find all sorts of different weird avenues of saying, okay, well, we're going to build lots of solar and wind. Yeah, but the problem with solar and wind is that if it's night and there's no wind, you have zero electricity output from these generators. And human civilization operates 24/7. So there's no free lunch there. On top of that, manufacturing solar panels requires a massive amount of electricity because you have to purify silicon. And the empirical reality is that China is producing almost all of the solar panels using coal-fired power plants, because it would actually be physically impossible to manufacture solar panels using solar electricity as the input to that manufacturing process. The equation would not balance. So they've really this scientific debate has devolved into, I would argue, a cult around carbon, quote unquote, right? And that it's really something that we have to work on deprogramming folks from. And that's why we created that response video to the New York Times of saying, hey, look, if we go out in the field using a CO2 measurement device and we go to a Bitcoin mining facility and we show you there's no carbon emissions out of this facility, what's your response? And their response was they just had a meltdown. They were, screaming at us on Twitter, you guys are so stupid. You're so stupid. They could not process this in a rational way because they're in a cult. And it's when faced with reality, it's really upsetting to them.
Yeah, one thing that I find so strange is they're basically telling the public that we can somehow leapfrog, reliable, cheap energy sources, go all renewable in deadlines that make absolutely no sense. And we're going to pay China to basically produce all of this for us by using fossil fuels. They're going to drive up costs of everything here. We're already bankrupt. And it's like common sense has just been thrown out the window. And then they attack Bitcoin and they don't lift up any of the most powerful, opportunities that Bitcoin offers. There's someone in America right now. There are many people, I'm sure, who are working their butts off to send money back home to Latin America or Southeast Asia. And before they would send $1,000, they would have to go through something like Western Union. It would settle in a couple of weeks and their family would see $700. And today they can send $1,000 over the Lightning Network and their family gets $1,000 in a matter of seconds. I mean, how could you not even show something like that within these articles? And instead you just focus on what you believe to be only negative, attributes of this industry. In terms of and I do want to mention that one of the people that's covering the fossil fuel and emissions debate really well, who also turns out to be a Bitcoiner, is Alex Epstein. I really recommend everyone read his book, Fossil Future. It helped me understand just the energy industry and things that are very misleading right now if you just turn on the news and you hear the climate change debate. But let's talk a little bit about rising costs, because this is an area where I did have some questions from the article. Demand response, right? So Bitcoin needs to use energy all the time, 24/7. There are areas in Texas where you live where there's negatively priced energy because sometimes the demand and the supply they don't match. And the article did talk about how there's sort of a program where a company like Riot makes money while they're mining Bitcoin. They get money because in the event of an emergency, they can step in, turn off all of the machines within, 10 minutes or so and give that energy back to the grid. And then they point out how much money that company will make. And it's, Bitcoin's essentially a lottery. You may have earned the Bitcoin, you may not. So this could actually be more profitable if the state were to go into an emergency. They're making millions and millions of dollars. So let's talk about the costs. Can you break down what these programs are and how demand response actually works?
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I get into the programs, I want to point out that in the article, they said that they ran a simulation that showed that Bitcoin miners increased electricity prices in Texas by
Yes.
5%.
Yes.
And I found it odd because one, electricity prices have gone up by more than 5% in Texas. So it had me scratching my head of what kind of simulation was this? Um, Second of all, to attribute it to Bitcoin mining, I think is ludicrous because at the end of the day, electricity prices have gone up in Texas because of US dollar debasement, money printing, from the Federal Reserve, nothing to do with Bitcoin. And two, natural gas prices, energy prices in general going up because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So number three would be the current administration's hostile posture towards production of domestic oil and gas. So on all three of the causes with regards to the rise in the cost of electricity here in Texas, nothing to do with Bitcoin mining. And furthermore, electricity prices have gone up less in Texas than in the rest of the United States.
Hmm.
So, despite lots of Bitcoin mining coming to Texas, there's been, net like a reduction in electricity prices compared to the rest of the United States. So, the article I think was deeply misleading in that regard. Now, furthermore, on the demand response side, I think it's really important for us to kind of get into the weeds here because I think this is a really interesting area, and it's also an area that the article did a terrible job of explaining. So I really see three layers to it. The first layer is that when we look at supply and demand of electricity on the grid, there are periods of time where there's too much demand and not enough supply. And because Texas has a market-based approach to electricity, during those times, the price of electricity goes up. Sometimes it even skyrockets. So, for example, in the summer, in the evening time when the sun is setting, you've got solar production going down. The wind might be dying down as well. So there's no wind power. And everyone's coming home and turning on their lights and turning on, their dishwasher and all that. And that actually causes, and in particular, turning on their AC because it's 100 degrees outside, despite the sun setting here in Texas. So during the summer, that causes electricity prices to go way up. You might even see things like $800 per megawatt hour. And at those electricity prices, if you are running a mining rig, even if you are getting paid, Bitcoin, you're still running at a loss because your cost of electricity is greater than the marginal revenue of the Bitcoin you're receiving. And so it's rational at that point to turn off your Bitcoin mining rig so that you're not paying these, I liken it to Uber surge pricing, right?
Right,
Um,
right.
and so you turn off your mining rigs, not because you're going to get a subsidy or anything like that, but purely to avoid the cost of this high, electricity price. So that's layer one. Layer two is you can enter into what's called a power purchase agreement with a power company where you say, hey, I'm committing myself to buying electricity from you for the next 10 years at this price in this quantity. And I'm going to put a big deposit up for this contract. The power company loves this because it gives them certainty about the future demand. And so they're going to give you a favorable electricity rate because essentially it's about wholesale pricing. and it's about their ability to then turn around and make a capital investment in electricity production so that they can bring more supply to market over the next 10 years. So these fixed rate power purchase agreements are contracts that, for example, Riot has entered into. And what happens at that point in, going back to the first scenario of the electricity price going up, instead of just turning off, we do also turn off, but we also get a credit to reimburse us for the electricity we had pre-purchased. So because we had bought this electricity, now we're selling it back into the market at this time, and thus earning a profit between the price, the fixed rate we pay, and this elevated spot market price that we're selling for. Because essentially what these PPAs are is a derivative that allows you to lock in a rate.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners. First up, CrowdHealth, a Bitcoin alternative to health insurance. Health insurance costs can be sky high today, and you essentially send money every month to a massive corporation, the health insurance black hole, as I call it. And if you don't need any health care, you never see that money again, right? But if you do need to go to a doctor, you end up having to pay even more out of pocket, especially if you end up as one of the 20% of claims on average that aren't covered. With CrowdHealth, you pay a small monthly fee that goes into an account that you actually accrue over time and is yours to use or keep if you ever leave. You can even save that money in Bitcoin. CrowdHealth is all about community, and the community crowdfunds everyone's healthcare. So if something does happen or you have a doctor visit, CrowdHealth will negotiate down the medical bill much lower than what insurance would be, and then the community helps you cover it. And in return, you help others cover their needs. For more information, you can head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. And if you use promo code Natalie, you get 6 months for $99.
Essentially what these PPAs are is a derivative that allows you to lock in a rate. So it's
the
just
article
like
doesn't make that clear. The article does not make this clear. They make it sound like basically you guys are getting money from the taxpayers of Texas all the time, whether you're mining Bitcoin or you turn off the machines to give the power back.
So that's layer 3, which they actually conflated with layer 2. And so that's where I think that the fraudulent misrepresentation happened in the New York Times article. But I would also analogize to if you got a 3% 30-year fixed rate mortgage 2 years ago, now you're doing really well because interest rates went up. Mm-hmm. If interest rates had gone down, you'd be wondering, oh, should I go through the cost of refinancing and whatnot, right? So hindsight is 2020. Electricity prices could have gone down. In fact, after Riot signed its PPA, electricity prices did go down, which meant that we were in the red and we had to pay margin to the power company. So the fact that electricity prices went up, that was not foreseeable by us. We were just trying to manage our risk in case it did. And again, it had more to do with fiat inflation than anything else. And I don't see why we should be held, responsible for that. So the third layer is these, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The third layer is these ancillary services run by ERCOT. So ERCOT in real time, there's kind of the electricity spot market of people buying and selling electricity. And you might look at that on a 1 hour or 15-minute or 5-minute increment lens. But when you get into less than 5 minutes, then this is where ERCOT has to manually adjust supply and demand. So they need to have controllable loads and controllable generation that they have their fingers on the knobs to turn up and down, because supply and demand has to be exactly matching on the electricity grid 24/7 in order for it to be reliable. This isn't like a business where you can have inventory laying around. Mm-hmm. So that's where ERCOT's ancillary services are critical for maintaining grid reliability. Now, with these ancillary services, you have different loads and different generators competing to provide this service to ERCOT. And so they put in bids, and whoever puts in the lowest bid wins the auction. and then ERCOT will, what ERCOT gets is the right to control your load or the right to control your generation. So essentially you're selling a derivative, an option, right? Giving ERCOT the right, but not the obligation to turn off your power or to turn it on.
Mm.
Um, and that
And then
allows
they
them
have to
to
pay you. They have to pay you for that time.
correct. So they are in order to get people to participate in this program, they incentivize folks, and it's competitive so that ERCOT gets the lowest cost. Now, what we've seen over the past couple of years is that Bitcoin miners can underbid the competition because we can provide these ancillary services at a much more competitive cost than anyone else because we are the most flexible load. And that is really um, causing some consternation among other participants in ancillary services who are saying, "Hey, these guys are eating our lunch. It's not fair." I mean, it's not fair in the same sense that it's not fair when somebody's competing with you and with a better product, right? So, for example, when Apple came out with the iPhone, Motorola said, "Hey, it's not fair." The iPhone or BlackBerry said it's not fair. The iPhone's better. Well, that's capitalism. That's the market. And so ancillary services are necessary for grid reliability. They're competitive here in Texas with this bidding system, and it's not like a handout or a subsidy to Bitcoin miners. And that's what I thought was really egregious about this New York Times article is that if policymakers actually listen to the New York Times, they don't worry. But if they did, then they would create bad policies. They would be misinformed and they would increase the cost to ratepayers for ancillary services, and they would decrease the reliability of the grid. So that's really, I think, an area where it goes beyond defrauding the readers and it goes into kind of interfering with public policy.
Well, the New York Times journalists really drive at that emotion, right? Of feeling like you're a homeowner and you're paying for electricity and it's sort of getting redirected and taxpayer money from some pool is getting paid to Bitcoin miners. I mean, they had a quote that says, ironically, when people are paying the most for their power or losing it altogether, the miners are making money selling energy back to Texans at rates 100 times what they paid. That was from a economics professor, Ed Heers at the University of Houston, who's obviously very critical. I mean, they're really trying to get people emotionally riled up that there's some injustice happening to the average person and these big companies are profiting.
That's right. And it's really fascinating because when Bitcoin miners are selling electricity back to the grid, we're helping lower the price of electricity by increasing supply. And so this criticism that they have, they could make of batteries, for example. Now, they won't do that about batteries because they don't have this animus against batteries like they do against Bitcoin, right? And for that matter, any kind of power plant that is selling electricity when electricity prices are high, they are earning windfall profits. But we want them to because we want more electricity, right? And high prices are a signal to bring supply to the market. Now, I really think the New York Times just is anti-market in general. So they're going to portray any market activity as being a negative rather than explaining to their readership why ultimately this is actually good for homeowners.
Well, just to kind of crystallize everything we talked about with the New York Times article, hopefully people have had a chance to read it. I'm gonna link it below because I think we really should be aware of the criticisms of Bitcoin out there so that we can formulate, our responses. Some of us are headed to DC to talk to policymakers to make sure they really, really understand. So zooming out before we start to wrap up, give me like the three biggest things. If you read this article or you're thinking about reading it, the three things that you really want people to know in light of that article, maybe the things that they got wrong and the big picture of what people really need to understand.
Yeah, so one, what they got right, which is that Bitcoin is a decentralized alternative monetary system that is global and creating value for millions of people and is growing. And eventually, I think will create value for billions of people. Um, Two is that the energy debate is really a debate about how electricity gets produced. And so, if we want to put a dent into carbon emissions, we have to focus on developing small modular reactors, and all sorts of other alternatives to coal and natural gas. Um, and that there's lots of renewables in Texas. Texas has more renewables than any other state. Um, and that with these renewables, because they are so unreliable, it's really important to have a demand response mechanism on the consumption side. And Bitcoin miners are ideally suited to do that. And the article even highlights that they say, hey, look, these facilities, they turn their electricity off 99%. Whereas a factory can only turn off 30%, for example, which gives them an unfair advantage. It's like, no, this is good. This is a competitive advantage for demand response. So this demand response from Bitcoin mining is good. And third, there's no subsidies here. This is purely a market-driven process, and it is about making sure that there's supply and demand that is balanced for electricity in the ERCOT market, and there's no subsidy from taxpayers or from ratepayers.
I asked these journalists if they would come on the show. I haven't heard back yet, but if you could talk to these writers that wrote this story, what would you say to them or ask them?
I mean, I'd say to them, like, why do you need to add the twist, right? For example, adding the smog to the picture. Um, you know, if the facts are on your side, couldn't they just stand on their own? Why do you need to kind of dial up the spin, rather than just portraying it accurately? Because ultimately, even from their perspective, right, it undermines their persuasiveness when they do obvious spin like this, and it undermines their credibility. So um, I think they're doing a disservice to the good faith criticisms of Bitcoin mining by engaging in these practices. And I want to understand, like, why, what's going on here.
I want to talk to you a little bit about some other topics just before we wrap up,
Yeah.
because last time I had you on the show, you said that you were working to try to lobby the government not to sell its Bitcoin. I think at the time you said that federal government had like 70,000 Bitcoins. I know some have been auctioned off already, but where are we at with that? And why do you feel that the government should essentially have a reserve of Bitcoin?
Yes, so they are auctioning them off. Sadly, I failed in my efforts to lobby against that. The reason why I think it's important is really the same reason why I think that individuals should hold Bitcoin and corporations should hold Bitcoin as part of their treasury strategy. It's about having a strategic reserve where you have a decentralized alternative to, for example, the United States has a strategic petroleum reserve. So then when the price of gasoline is very high, they're able to sell oil. Or if we were to go to war, we would have a cushion of raw material in order to engage in armed conflict. Same thing, the United States has a gold reserve, Fort Knox, and under the New York Fed. Now, I haven't audited that, so I don't know if that's real or not. But third, massive reserve of land, right? Of federal land that is, occasionally leased out, but for the most part, held kind of in trust for future generations. So it's really about hedging and saying, hey, look, we don't know what the future holds. What we do know is that Bitcoin, because it's decentralized, it has the least uncertainty. It's actually the lowest risk. If we just focus on the price, it looks very high risk. But if we zoom out and look at the software engineering and the fundamentals of the system, it's actually very low risk. And so that's where I think it makes sense for the government to have a strategic reserve of Bitcoin, in order to hedge against future uncertainty.
Are you going to be in DC for the Bitcoin Policy Summit?
Unfortunately, I'm missing that. I'm going to be on paternity leave.
Oh, well, congratulations. That's awesome. Well, one other thing you said on the show, this was again June 2021, you said that Bitcoin will replace the dollar. And I think just in the last couple of months, I've seen even mainstream outlets on both sides talking about how countries are de-dollarizing, people are starting to make deals in other currencies. I mean, this is pretty significant. Sure, we've heard, some of this talk before in the past, but what are your thoughts now?
Yeah, I still think that's the case. And I think that it's another argument for having a strategic reserve of Bitcoin is that if we lose the dollar's place as the global reserve currency, let's position ourselves to be in a really good spot by holding Bitcoin. And so the other part of it too is that with Bitcoin replacing the US dollar as kind of the most important strategic asset, it only increases the importance of having Bitcoin mining here in the United States. What we're hearing is that there is a massive growth of Bitcoin mining in Russia,
Mhm.
and if the United States wants to effectively deprive Russia of resources, right? That's the whole point of these sanctions. Then we need to ramp up Bitcoin mining here in the United States and take as much market share from them as possible. So that's kind of another message to bring to policymakers.
Right, that's what I was saying, the last time I was on Fox. Why would we reject a technology that is literally impervious to any hacking? No nation state can bring it down. It's on the secondary layer with Lightning. It is a secure transactions protocol in a world that's moving toward more AI, where you need to be able to verify and authenticate information. Why would we reject that? That's wild to me. So hopefully, folks like you're doing education with Riot. We need to just educate everybody, and we need to educate the New York Times. Any final thoughts?
You're doing a great job educating as well. Thanks for all you do, Natalie, for Bitcoin. And yeah, thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Coin Stories. Again, hit like on the video and make sure that you have those notifications on so you don't miss out on any new episodes. And I would love to hear from you. If you have suggestions, feedback, guest requests, please email me at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Thanks so much.